Welcome to ITF demo series. My name is Alexander Yahovich, and in this episode I will demonstrate how to test lifecycle events in IdentityIQ using ITF framework. I will start by explaining what kind of data we can use to trigger IIQ events. Then I will show you commands you can use to trigger them, and finally we'll see how to handle testing of the data that should not trigger events. In general, there is unlimited number of ways to trigger an event in IIQ, considering that you can use custom rules as triggering mechanism. Having said that, most of the time, lifecycle events trigger based on either static data, for example, lever starting when last day is set to today, or dynamic change, for example, mover when department changes from one value to another. I want to demonstrate both of these cases. First, let's look at lifecycle rule that we're testing. Is lever today rule will read last day attribute from identity, and if that value equals today, it will return true. So this translates to lifecycle event being triggered. Okay, the first thing to do is create brand new test case. I right click here, select ITF test case, and let's call it lever test 1. To run this test, we need test identity. So let's select one. Right click, test identity, and let's select Philip Carpenter. We are going to be triggering a lifecycle event, so we don't need simulation, we don't need assignment. In order to trigger lifecycle event in IIQ, we need to run a refresh. So let's insert a refresh command, and we will need to use process events checkbox. Okay, very good. Now, before we run the test case, we have to make sure that the actual value of the last day attribute is set correctly. Let's open the XML for Philip Carpenter. We can see that he does not have this value yet. So let's add this. Last day value, and let's set it to today's date, which is 8th. And save. Currently, the system is configured that if the lifecycle event gets triggered, it will print that it's running to the log file. So let's run the test case. And let's look at the log. As we can see, the lever process was started, and we have a running test case for lifecycle rule. But this value will only work today. If we run this test case tomorrow, it will no longer be valid. That's why in ITF you can use these so-called pseudo values, and in this case we're going to use a pseudo value called today. So every time you import that identity, it will replace today with today's date. Let's run this test case again. And again, it was successful, the process was started. Now we're working on this lever process, and let's say that this date was actually set to yesterday. Logically, we would want this trigger to be set not only for today, but today and any other date in the past. So let's set it to today -2. And let's run it. As you can see here, the test case finished, but the lever process was not started. Let's look at the current data. Okay, let's go to debug. If we look at the data, we can see here that this is 2 days ago. So obviously our rule is not correct. Let's have a look at the rule that I showed you at the beginning. It is only comparing the last day to today, but actually we have to fix it. And it needs to look whether the last day is equal to today or is before today. So let's deploy the changes. Reload. And now with the current test case, we can run it again. Perfect. It is working now correctly. So we just tested the process. We found that something was wrong with it. And finally, we fixed it. Let's look at other ways to trigger events. Very often, lifecycle events respond not to static data, but to dynamic changes. Let's look at the example. IsLocationChange method reads new identity and old identity. It will read location values from both identity and compare them. It will only return true if these values actually change. So how do we test this in ITF? We test this in ITF the same way we would test it normally, but we automate the process. Let's create a new test case. Let's call it mover test 1, and let's pick test identity. Let's pick any random identity, James Smith. We don't need any simulation and assignment. Let's save it and let's look at James Smith identity. The location is Austin. In order to trigger lifecycle event, we're going to need to trigger refresh. So let's insert refresh with process events. But as you can imagine, this will not work because we need that value to change. And to do that, basically in our configuration, we need to run aggregation. But we don't want to start a whole new aggregation. We just want to aggregate new data for this particular identity. So the best way to do it in ITF is to run so-called mocked aggregation. So let's insert that command. We're gonna mock aggregate from HR application. And what happens here is mocked aggregate command will read from XML data that it downloaded from the server. And here we have all the values from the link we just selected. In this particular case, location is still Austin. So let's change Austin to something different. Let's put the value London in here. And in mover test, we're going to upload original James Smith identity with location value Austin. Then we're going to run mocked aggregate command that will import this data and perform a real aggregation with the value London. And finally, we're gonna process the triggers. Let's run this test case and look at the log file. as we see here, a mover task for James Smith was started, which means this is how you test lifecycle events with dynamic data using ITF. Is refresh the only command to trigger lifecycle events? Let's have a look. What we have seen so far is not perfect yet, though. Let's go back to the first lever test case, when the code was wrong and was only detecting lever on today's date. Let's go back to our test case. Today is the last day is set to today minus 2 days, and let's run our test case. Let's look at the log. Nothing happened. There was no exception, which means the test finished okay. But we want that test case to throw an exception because we want to throw when the process was not triggered, and refresh command will just not do that. That is why in ITF we have a special command for testing lifecycle events, and it's called process events. Let's replace refresh with our process events command, and let's discuss how is that different. In process event command, we specify identity trigger that we are expecting to be triggered. In this case, it's called lever. And the main difference between process events and refresh command is that process events will wait and will expect the lever process to start. And if it doesn't, it will throw. Let's run this test case. You see, we run the process events command, and now it's waiting for the lifecycle event to trigger. We have to wait a bit until the timeout. And now it throws exception because it was expecting the lever process to trigger. Okay, let's fix the problem again in our lifecycle rule. Let's save the changes, redeploy them to the server. Now that the code is fixed, we're expecting the lifecycle event to be triggered. Let's run the test case. And in this case, everything went fine and there was no exception. The process event command found that the lever process was triggered and the whole test is finished successfully. So as you can see here, for testing lifecycle events, it is better to use process events command because it will tell you whether expected lifecycle event was actually triggered or not. Finally, let's have a look at test cases when we want to make sure that we actually don't trigger events. As I mentioned before, when we're testing lifecycle events, we have to make sure that they get triggered exactly when they need to, but also that they do not trigger when they shouldn't. Let's go back to our lever test case and see how to do this in ITF. Let's look at our identity. The last day is set to today minus 1. Let's change that and set it to today plus 2. So basically, the last day will be in 2 days. And let's run the lever test again. Let's look at the log file. It's running process events command, and what we're expecting is actually we're expecting an exception because with our data right now, the lever shouldn't be triggered. So the exception was correct, but in this particular case, we actually don't want the test case to throw exception. We want it to finish successfully. That is why in ITF, the process events command has got an extra setting called no expected, coming from no operation expected. Let's set that to true. Let's save it and let's run the test case again. In this case, it actually notices that no test case lifecycle event was triggered and it finishes successfully. And this is how you test that identity trigger should not be triggered with certain kind of data. So now you know how to write test cases for all types of lifecycle events. And this is it for today. Hit that like button if you found this useful and subscribe if you want more. See you next time.